There is a particular way British television learned to build characters. Men are treated as subjects. They carry the story, they define its movement, they exist at the centre of events. Women, more often than not, are treated as roles: the wife, the mother, the girlfriend, the problem. Even when those roles are well written, they remain functions. They exist in relation to something else, someone else. What is striking about the work of Carla Lane is that she stepped quietly to one side of that structure and did something that should not feel radical, but did. She wrote women as people, not as support, not as contrast, not as narrative devices, but as subjects in their own right. And once television made that shift, everything else began to change. To see how that works in practice, it helps to look at Butterflies. On the surface, Butterflies looks completely familiar. A suburban home, a husband, two sons, a life that appears stable, settled, and complete. Television understands this world very well. It usually treats it as background, a place where stories begin before something more dramatic takes over. Carla Lane does something different. She keeps the camera there. Ria's life does not break down, it continues. Meals are prepared, conversations repeat, days pass without incident. She stands at the kitchen window, not doing anything in particular, just looking out as if something might happen. She speaks and then stops, as if the thoughts have nowhere to go. She meets someone who represents change and then returns home, unchanged in any visible way. Nothing decisive happens. And yet the series is built on tension. That tension is not external, it is perceptual. Ria is not trapped in the conventional sense. She is not oppressed, not endangered, not forced into action, but she is aware that her life does not quite fit, aware that something is missing, aware that this awareness itself has no clear resolution. Most television would turn that into a problem to be solved. Butterflies does not. What Carla Lane is doing here is shifting what television treats as drama. Ordinarily, television builds itself around events. Something happens, characters respond, the situation changes. Here, the event is recognition. A person looking at their own life and understanding it differently. That does not produce action, it produces thought. And thought does not behave like plot. It does not move forward cleanly. It does not resolve on schedule. It does not provide closure. So the series does not provide closure either. Not because nothing has happened, but because what has happened cannot be concluded. This is where Lane's writing becomes very precise. She is not removing drama, she is relocating it from the outside to the inside, from action to perception, from resolution to continuation. This is not something that begins with Butterflies. Earlier work, such as The Liverbirds, presents women living independently, not as extensions of family roles, but as people already negotiating their own lives. What changes later is not the principle, but the focus. The same attention that was once given to independence is now turned inward toward dissatisfaction, reflection, and the difficulty of understanding a life that appears complete. Television does not always find that easy to accommodate. It prefers clarity, characters that can be understood quickly, situations that can be summarized, problems that can be resolved. Carla Lane resists that preference, but she does it without rejecting the form. Butterfly still looks like a sitcom. The structure is familiar, the setting is familiar, the rhythms are familiar. What changes is the emphasis. The domestic space is no longer background, it becomes the subject. Kitchens, conversations, routines. Not as incidental detail, but as the material of the drama itself. That is a deliberate decision. Because by keeping everything at that level, Lane is making a point about what television chooses to notice. These are not small things, they are the structure of a life. And by treating them seriously, she allows a different kind of character to emerge. Ria is not a symbol of dissatisfaction. She is a person who feels dissatisfied. That distinction matters because a symbol is stable. It represents an idea. A person is unstable. They hesitate. They contradict themselves. They think one thing and do another. Lane writes the second. And once that happens, the logic of the programme changes. Scenes do not exist to advance a plot. They exist to reveal how someone understands their own situation. Conversations do not resolve. They circle. They stop. They leave something unsaid. Episodes do not conclude. They pause. This is why butterflies can feel both gentle and uneasy at the same time. On the surface, very little is happening. Underneath, something is constantly shifting. Not the situation, but the perception of it. If you place this within the wider context of British television, the difference becomes clearer. There are programmes built around pressure and decision. There are programmes built around institutions and authority. There are programmes built around action and consequence. Carla Lane is working in a space that those programmes tend to pass over. She is writing about what happens when nothing changes, or more precisely, when nothing changes outwardly, because internally, everything is in motion. That is difficult to dramatise. There is no obvious entry point, no single event that defines it, no resolution that confirms it. But it is where most people live. What Lane demonstrates is that television is capable of holding that space if it chooses to. It can observe rather than declare. It can allow uncertainty rather than eliminate it. It can treat interior life as something substantial. And she does this without making the work feel obscure or inaccessible. Butterflies is recognisable. It does not announce itself as different. It simply operates differently. That is part of its effectiveness, because the audience arrives expecting one kind of experience and is given another, not abruptly, gradually. This also changes how women are positioned within the programme. They are no longer there to support the narrative, they generate it, not through action, but through perception, not through decisions, but through awareness. And that shift is significant, because once a character is treated as a subject, their experience becomes central, not what happens to them, but how they understand what happens. That is a quieter form of drama, but it is no less real. And it sits alongside other forms of British television rather than opposing them. You can have stories about pressure, about institutions, about authority. Carla Lane adds something else. She writes about the space people occupy when they are not under pressure, not making decisions, and not resolving anything. The space where they simply live. And she writes about how they are living. That is not a rejection of television, it is an expansion of it. Because once that space is acknowledged, it becomes visible everywhere. You begin to notice it when it is present and when it is absent. In a medium that prioritises action, Carla Lane prioritises thought. Where television looks for resolution, she allows continuation. And where it prefers clarity, she allows ambiguity. And in doing so, she creates something that feels both specific and widely recognisable. Not because it simplifies experience, but because it reflects it. To return to that initial distinction, British television has long been comfortable building its stories around men as subjects. Carla Lane does not argue against that. She simply applies the same seriousness elsewhere. She writes women not as roles within a story, but as people within their own lives. And once that happens, the story changes. Not in scale, not in structure, but in what it chooses to pay attention to. That is a small shift, but it has large consequences, because it allows television to represent something it often overlooks, not crisis, not action, not resolution, but the ongoing experience of living. And that is where Carla Lane's work remains distinctive, not because it is louder, but because it is more attentive. It pays attention to how people think, how they hesitate, how they live with questions that do not have answers. And in doing so, it demonstrates something very simple and very easy to miss, that a life does not need to change in order to be understood differently, that dissatisfaction does not need to be resolved in order to matter, and that people, when written with care and precision, are always more complex than the roles they are given. Carla Lane understood that, and she built her work around it consistently, quietly, which is why, When you look at it closely, it feels like a departure from television and more like a correction, a reminder that beyond plot, beyond structure, beyond expectation, there is something else worth paying attention to: the way that people think, the way they feel, the way they live with the lives they have. Thank you very much for listening. I always appreciate that. And I will be back on another day with another television show. Bye.